Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Today we're going to make a grime guard. If you do hand embroidery or cross stitch, you're probably already familiar with a grime guard. But basically a grime guard is just what it says. It'll guard your project and your fabric away from grime. There are many different ways that you can hold an embroidery piece or a cross stitch project, but most people will use either a hoop or a Q-snap. Now there are also wooden frames, but the grime guards for those are made differently, so today we're just going to concentrate on the hoop and the Q-snap. Now this is just a Michael's version of a Q-snap, but basically the process is always going to be the same. It's just going to be different based on what item you're using. A grime guard is just a simple tube of fabric with elastic on both sides. It goes over your project. If you don't have a camera right next to you, it goes over your project a lot easier. But it just goes over the frame and over your project, and it protects what you're working on. This is my Halloween project. This is where most people have seen the grime guard from my Talk to Me Tuesday video. I have an embroidery hoop that I'm using for it, and the grime guard just goes all around it. So as you're holding it, your hands will hold onto the grime guard and it won't actually touch the fabric. So if you have any oils on your hand, or if you're one of those people that are eating Cheetos while you're stitching, no. Remember, use a toothpick when eating Cheetos so your fingers never turn orange. But if you are snacking, or you happen, whatever you get on your hands, it'll stay on the grime guard and it'll stay off your fabric. Another good use of the grime guard is if you're working on a project that's bigger than your hoop, like mine is extra long, you can roll up that extra fabric and keep it inside your grime guard and it'll stay out of the way. You won't stitch it to your project, and it'll also stay nice and clean. I like to tuck mine along the top edge of my hoop because I have been known to stitch it to my project when it's on the back. See, then you have, I don't have my hoop very tight because I'm not working on the project right now. So you have your work area, you have your extra fabric that you can keep tucked up out of the way, and everything will stay nice and clean. When you have it like this, it really just looks like a steering wheel cover, right? And it's the same thing while using the Q-snap. Now my Q-snap is an 11-inch Q-snap, but my hoop is a 10-inch hoop, but I use the same grime guard for both. As you can see on this one, you don't have as much of the extra fabric that rolls over onto your project, to where this one you have all that bits of extra right there. So that's going to be a personal decision. If you tend to work a project in an 8-inch Q-snap or an 11, and that's the size of your project, and you're not working on like a Hade, which is a heaven and earth design, and those things could be huge, you might want to make it a certain width just to cover your Q-snap or your embroidery hoop, or you might want to have it a little bit larger so that you can tuck in the fabric. I generally just make mine all the same size. If I'm using a smaller hoop, of course I will need to make it smaller. This hoop, this is only an 8-inch hoop, but if I were to take my 11-inch grime guard and put it on this hoop, it wouldn't work. As you would expect, it would be too loosey-goosey. But if I had a lot of fabric and I was using a smaller hoop, then I'd have all this room to put the fabric in. Okay, so that's just the basics of a grime guard. Like I said, it's just a simple tube. It's got hemmed edges and it's got an elastic in the side. Now the supplies you're going to need to make your grime guard are really pretty simple. You're going to need whatever it is you plan on covering, whichever size hoop or Q-snap that you need to cover. You need your fabric of choice. It's helpful to have just one of these little cheap old plastic tape measures, and I use 1/4-inch elastic. I buy mine by the giant roll, then I just label it on top. I like to keep it in this plastic jug thing that I got from the Dollar Tree, and it keeps it nice and clean. It keeps the dust off of it, and I like to keep it in a cool, dark area because elastic does disintegrate with sun and heat. And since this is not exactly clear, but it is a little bit semi-opaque, so the sun doesn't always get through it as easily. But I keep it in a dark area of my room so the sun doesn't hit it. Now your fabric is going to depend on the size of the hoop or Q-snap that you're making. Now anyone who's familiar with Q-snaps know that these come apart, and you can have, this one's 11 by 11, but you could have it 8 by 15 or 11 by 15 or 8 by 8, depending on the size of the side pieces you have. You can make it extend to whatever you need. So you need to figure out, it's kind of almost working backwards. Before you purchase the fabric, you need to go ahead and figure out what you're covering. Now I know my Q-snap is 11 by 11, but what you would do, sometimes, since this is a generic one from Michaels, you might want to measure all the way around. You just take it from corner to corner, and then you just measure all the way around to make sure that you're getting, it's going to be 44 inches. Or you could just simply, of course, measure each side, and you're going to add up all 4 sides. Or if you're doing a hoop, you can do the whole circumference, pi r squared, and radius and all that. Or you can just as easily put your tape measure on it, run it around, and there you go. You know it's 27 inches all the way around. So then you either get your fabric from your stash or you go to the store. Now generally for an 11 by 11 and your smaller hoops, if you're using a really large hoop like I'm doing my buttons on, you would probably need more than a fat quarter, but you can usually get away with a fat quarter for these. I have actual yardage just because I pulled this from my stash. I even have bits and pieces in here that might work. So if you were to have a few pieces like this or a fat quarter, what you can do is you can cut the fat quarter by the width that we're going to determine, and then you can just add the pieces and hem them and stitch them together to make a longer length. It'd be like making binding for your quilt. You're just going to keep adding it together until you get the length you need. Okay, since we are using, now don't worry, the math on this is really simple. You know me, I'm not really big on doing big math equations to try to figure things out. I like to round things up and make things really simple. We're going to be working with an 11-inch Q-snap, and we're going to make a grime guard to match that. So now we know that a square has 4 sides and that each side is 11 inches. So 11 times 11, simple math, is 44. Now we're going to obviously going to have to sew pieces together to make a circle. So you're going to have a hem, a little simple hem, but they recommend you add 2 inches to this number to cover everything up. So it gives you enough room. If you make it exactly 44 inches, you're going to have a really hard time putting it on. Have you ever bought a new steering wheel cover and tried to stretch it across your steering wheel? Those are meant to be extremely tight because you don't want them to move around. But for this Q-snap, you want to have extra room for your grime guard to easily fit around all 4 corners and have that little bit extra to tuck your fabric in. So they recommend adding 2 inches to whatever your total circumference is of your device. So it's really simple. Our fabric needs to be 46 inches in length. Now with everything, there's always that big debate. Each person likes to do things differently. So you have to determine what you want your width of your fabric to be. You can simply just put your tape measure and kind of guess which way, how much you want it to be and how wide and how far over. But there's a general rule that everyone says that the width of your fabric should be 6 inches to start with. That's going to give you plenty of room to make your hem, which allows you to have that casing for your elastic. And then it gives you plenty of room on the inside to hold extra fabric without being in your way when you're putting it on your Q-snap. This was one of the ones I experimented on. So my finished measurement is 3.5 here. So I probably started this one at 5.5 inches. And I think that extra little bit is just nice, because as we've seen, this one just goes around the Q-snap perfectly without much room to tuck in the fabric. You have a little bit of room. It's not too tight, but this is better for my hoop, and it gives me that extra room to tuck in my fabric. As we're going through this process, we will be able to adjust these numbers at any time, so that if it's a little bit too wide, you can always take in an extra hem, and then we can always adjust our elastic length also. Now our elastic length, you're going to need 2 pieces of elastic, because as you see, we have 2 channels. And what you want your elastic to be is it's going to be 2 sides of your hoop. So whatever this number is, you want your elastic to be half of this. So our elastic is going to be 22 inches, and we need to have 2 pieces. Now I know a lot of this sounds really complicated. There's a lot of different numbers and a lot of talking, but once we get going and you see the actual process, you'll see how easy it is, and it sounds more complicated than it is, trust me. I decided to switch it up a little bit here, and instead of using the flower fabric, I pulled out this fat quarter of Wonder Woman fabric I have, because I was thinking, well, a lot of us have yardage, and it would be really easy to go ahead and cut our 46-inch length from yardage, because we know most fabric is 42 by 44. You're still going to have to piece together, but if you were to cut it the lengthwise instead of the width, you could get that 46 inches. But if you had a fat quarter, we can still make this project. So I went ahead and I pressed out my fat quarter, and I measured it to make sure, because we know not everything is exactly the same in the sewing world. And my fat quarter does measure 22 inches in length, and it does measure 18. So it is the full fat quarter of 18 by 22. And as you can see, Wonder Woman is kind of all over. I don't really recommend a directional fabric. You can use a directional fabric, but it's really not going to show up, because it's always going to be put on your hoop, and different pieces are going to be upside down, right side up. But if it's a fabric you love, go ahead and use it, because it's for you, and if you don't care, then who should else care, right? How you want to cut this, whether you want to cut it at the long length or you want to cut it at the short width, is going to be determined by how even and how square up your fat quarter is. Now, we don't have to have exactly a 6-inch measurement, but if you're choosing to have anything wider, or if you have something larger than 11 by 11 Q-snap, you're probably going to need to get 2 fat quarters for it. Now mine seems to be pretty, I'm going to have to trim off a little smidgen off this side, but it seems pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut 3 6-inch widths from my long length of my fat quarter. Okay, I have my 3 pieces. I'm going to go ahead and take these over to my sewing machine. Well, first I had to cut off the selvages. I always forget that until the last second. But I want to cut off these selvages, and then I want to go ahead and I want to stitch all 3 of these together to make one long length. There we go. So just like lengthening a border or for binding, I'm just going to stitch these just straight together like this. We don't need to do any bias sewing at all. Once this gets all gathered up, you won't even see the seam. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to give this a nice generous 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch seam, and then I have an overcast stitch, or you can use a serger or a zigzag stitch, and I want to just go ahead and go over all of these seams as after I stitch them, just to make sure that they're not going to fray, because there's going to be a lot of wear and tear on these grime guards. Plus, since they're grime guards, they need to be easily to be washed over and over again. So I'll show you what that looks like when I come back. As you can see, since I have plenty of fabric and length, I went with a 1/2 inch or so on my seam allowance, and I did an overcast stitch because I do not have a serger. I use this all the time when I'm making clothes and stuff, And this holds up really well in the wash. It stops everything from fraying too far, and I don't have to worry about it. Then I went ahead and I pressed them all into the same direction. Now some people will serge each seam separately or overcast it and then press the seam open, and you can do that if you want. I tend not to because I like the extra strength and durability of having my seam pressed over. You could also top stitch here to hold it down if you chose. When it's time to put the elastic in the casing, if you always press to the same direction, your elastic will go over it like this. But if you press both seams open, then you would have to top stitch down. If you chose not to top stitch down, as your elastic is going through on either your little tool or your safety pin, you're going to keep running into these seams, and it just really makes it a lot harder to get the elastic go through. So then I need this to be the 46 inches. Now you can cut that 46 inches however you wish, but if you can see for mine, right here is my seam, and here's my 46 inches right here. Now I can choose to have my two seams this close together, or what I can do is I can determine how long my actual fabric is. And my final measurement on my piece is 62 inches. I need to have mine at 46 inches, and 62 inches is 16 inches longer than I need. So what I can do is I can just go ahead and take 8 inches off of both ends, and that'll make sure that I don't have two seams really close to each other. When you're working on this project, there really is a lot of wiggle room. I mean, not a lot, like in big giant chunks, but you have little places where you have a little bit of wiggle room that if the numbers aren't exactly right, and instead of making it 6 inches, you make it 5 3/4 inches, you'll be fine. And instead of 46 inches, if it's 47 or 45, you're going to be okay. And if you make it too small, just buy a smaller Q-snap or a smaller hoop, right? My suggestion is always to start with a fabric that you like, but is not your favorite fabric, to test out any pattern that you're working on. That way, if some kind of oops happens, you're not going to ruin your favorite fabric and have to either buy more, or if it's one you bought 10 years ago that they don't make anymore, then you won't be missing out on anything. Okay, so we have our 46-inch piece. Now we have to determine how we're going to make our casings. In my sewing room, there's basically two ways to make a casing. You can go ahead and serge or overstitch this whole, both of your long lengths, and then you can just fold it over 3/4 of an inch for your 1/2 inch elastic to go through. You will have a raw edge here, and if you're just making it for yourself, as long as you serge or overcast this edge, it will be fine. It will be nice and secure, and you can always put an extra, you can run 2 lines of stitching down here if you want. That way you know you're extra secure from fraying. Or you can go ahead and fold over a 1/4 inch, and then fold over an additional 3 1/4 inches and make a nice hemmed casing so that everything will be inside. As you stitch over about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch from your edge here, it'll hold in all those edges. It'll keep this little tucked in piece from fraying, and you won't have to worry about it. If you're making it to sell in your shop, I definitely recommend you go ahead and make a casing this way. What I'm going to do on this one is I'm just going to go ahead and overlock one side, and I will make the casing on the other so we can see what that looks like. Stitching, I went ahead and I also overcast my 2 short ends, and I did 1 whole length. Now remember, you can overcast, you can serge, or you can just use a zigzag stitch to stop this from fraying. You can also choose to do the hem. Now, most of the time, if you go somewhere, like you can buy clothing at the store that has this and it stops it from fraying. I would imagine if you went to Walmart or Target and bought a cloth steering wheel cover, that the edges would be serged. And more than likely, they would just have a hem like this. But if you want to make sure that your grime guard is going to last, and you want it to look nice if you're selling it in your shop, you want your shop to stand out from others, to just go ahead and fold it and make your little hem there. And I'm going to show you how on this edge. When I was making jammy pants and everything, I bought one of these Dritz Easy Hem. Try not to kill you with the bright light here. I bought a Dritz Easy Hem it's a piece of metal that you could fold your fabric over and iron right onto it, and it makes it easier to make hems so that you can measure. It has all a variety of measurements that you can use. So I'm going to go ahead and use this today to make it easier to make the hems. Now my 1/4 inch mark is just right here around this corner. I think that might be more for sleeves. I have a 1/2 inch one here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of go along. It gives you a little bit of a mark for the halfway, and since it doesn't have to be exact, I'm just going to go ahead and fold this up about halfway and give it a good press. Now if you're having, I have the steam set on my iron. If you're having problems getting your hem to stay, it's a really good idea to go ahead and use some starch. That'll help keep your hem in the right spot, your little casing, and you won't have to worry about it coming undone. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through and get this first part of my casing all ironed over, and I'll be right back. Now if you don't have one of these guides, it is just as easy to fold it over a little bit and then just go ahead and press it. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exact. If you are using this one, you need to be really careful though, because as you're ironing it with the steam and everything, the metal does get really hot. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and fold this over 3/4 of an inch. We could use the fancy dancy tool again, but I'm just going ahead and just kind of make sure I have enough for my elastic to go through. You could always just take your elastic out. Fold it over and just make sure you have enough room for it to fit through. Now remember, you're going to be stitching down to hold this, so you want to make sure you give yourself just enough room. It doesn't need to be too big because you don't want your elastic just slopping around in there. I'm going to go ahead and take this to my machine now, and I'm going to stitch just 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. You're just basically like top stitching right along this edge just to hold this hem down. Now since I haven't made a Q-snap since I haven't made a grime cover in a while, when I first make one I always seem to make the same silly mistake. Before you sew your casing all the way over, you want to go ahead and sew both of your sides together. Make sure you're not twisted. And you want to stitch this together. And then as you're making the casing, you want to make sure you leave probably about a 1-inch slot on each side so that you can thread your elastic through. Now I have done it before, and I tried it where after I stitched the casing, then I sewed this. And it does work, but then I always felt like this part needed to be stitched down. So it's totally up to you. You can sew it either before or you could stitch it after. I prefer doing it before I make my casing. Everything just seems to lay nice and flat that way. Oh, I'm not sure what happened there, but you guys almost fell over. All right, so, and as I was saying, if you make a mistake or what you feel is a mistake and you wanted to go ahead and sew your edge over, I'm trying to find where I started. See, I like how neat, if I stitch my two ends together first and then put my casing down, I like how neat this looks here. Otherwise you have this piece, and if you stitch it, you have to do it after your elastic's in, and it gets kind of bumpity-lumpity, but I like this. So here's where I started. This is where I went ahead, like I said, and I serged or overcasted here. This is the side where I folded it and I made it all nice and neat. And this is the side, I didn't even iron the hem ahead of time. I just went, I keep a ruler by my sewing machine, and I just made sure I stayed at around 3/4 of an inch or less, give or take 1/8 of an inch either way, and to have my 1/4 inch casing, my elastic to go through that casing. I left an opening here to start and an opening here to slide my elastic through. That's what it looks on the inside. Here's what the outside looks like. This side, it's thinner. and this one that you can feel that it's an extra thicker casing and it's a little bit sturdier feeling. But if you're just making this for yourself and you don't want to deal with the whole process, you can just easily do this. Now after I go ahead and get the elastic through, I'll show you what it looks like and you can see if there's any visible difference. One thing to make sure is that you didn't make it an infinity one and that nothing is twisted when you stitch it together and you have one easy, simple circle. Okay, now I'm going to determine the length of my elastic. If you remembered, where's my numbers? If you remembered, we calculated our elastic to be 2 sides of our Q-snap or half of the distance around our circle. So it's total 44. We're cutting 2 elastics at 22 inches. We're not going to worry too much about overflap. You could put an extra inch in there, but I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the 22 and cut 2 of them. Most cutting boards are 24 inches, so you can just go ahead and use that as your measurement. Now the reason we're cutting it just for 2 sides is because we do want those casings to come together really nice and tight. I know they have fancy little tools to thread this through, a bodkin or something like that, but I still do the old-fashioned with the safety pin. I fold over the end, just pop it through. My pin has a little burr on the end I can feel. And then I'm going to feed this through my casing. It might be a good idea to put a pin where you started and left that little hole, because once you start messing around with it, you will lose that spot. Here we go. Now, this is where my hole is, and as you can see, this is the way I ironed all my seams down. So I'm going to want to go this way so I don't hook and get hit on that seam there. Now I probably should have used a smaller safety pin, a little bit narrower in width, because this is a little bit tight, but that's okay. Go through and I'll feed this all the way through. One of the things you have to watch for when you're feeding the elastic through, because you're only doing a half a length, you might get a little crazy and you can put a pin on the end to stop it from getting put through. I just put a little clover clip, because otherwise you'll just keep pushing it through the casing and you'll lose the end. Not that I've ever done that, right? I think that's something we've all done when doing elastic at one point or another. You could also pin it to the fabric so that it doesn't go through. Okay, I went ahead. This is the one with my regular fancy dancy fold over hem, and I just held both pieces. You can tie these together or safety pin them. I just held them both with the clover clip while I'm waiting. And I went ahead and did the other side at the same time. Now you can take these to your sewing machine and just overlap them about a half an inch or an inch, and then you can stitch across it. You can hand stitch these together. You can tie it in a knot, but a knot might come undone and you will feel that bunch, that knot within your casing, and you might not want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and take these to the sewing machine. I'm going to make sure they're nice and secure. Kind of just bunch up the fabric a little so that my elastics are easy to get to, and I'll show you what that looks like. When you're working with such narrow elastic, it can be very difficult to go ahead and get it stitched together at the ends like this, and mine is never pretty. If it's too much for you, when you're working with wider elastic, it's really simple, but when it's just this little narrow 1/4 inch, you can just take a needle and thread and stitch it together and it'll also be fine. Then you just want to kind of tug at it and distribute the elastic around a little bit. And the last thing is we're going to need to sew these little, where we put our elastic through, we need to stitch these closed. So when you get to the sewing machine, you can put a couple pins in it right here through the elastic to hold it, but mostly I'll put my presser foot and I'll start a little bit further back, maybe an inch or so from the actual hole here, and then I'll just kind of give this a gentle tug to hold the fabric tight and to make sure the elastic's not in the way. Wiggle the elastic all the way up to the edge here, and then just stitch these 2 holes closed, and I will show you what that looks like. And that's really it. There's more talking about how to make it and showing the little steps than really it takes you to make these. You could probably make one, after you make your first one, your next ones after that would probably take you 15 minutes or less. Now when I was sewing the elastic together, before I closed up the hole, I was a little concerned. My first thought was, oh, I need to make sure the elastic's not twisted in there. But with such a narrow elastic and for the project that it is, it's not as noticeable. Now since I've made this before, I do know that it's going to fit just the way I like. See, it just gives you that little bit extra. It stays out of your stitching area. The smaller your hoop or your Q-snap, the narrower you're probably going to want this fabric, because if you're only using an 8-inch hoop, you don't want a bunch of fabric coming into your stitching space. Now I do have one more simple little tip and trick for you. Before you go ahead and sew your elastic together and sew your hole closed, go ahead and put it on your Q-snap or your hoop or whatever it is that you're making this for to see if it fits nice and snug. If you've made your elastic too long, you can always just narrow it down, you know, cut off the extra, make a longer part where you stitch it together so that it's a little bit tighter. Then if it's a little bit way too tight, then you've just made one for an 8-inch Q-snap instead of 11. Congratulations! No, you can always just go ahead and get a new piece of elastic. The price of elastic is really not that much, so it's okay to go ahead and get a new one. Just save that extra piece that you made for if you're going to make a smaller smaller cover. But that's it. I hope everything was understandable and easy for you. I'm sorry it took a lot of steps and a lot of talking, but overall, as I said, it's a really simple project. Pick your favorite fabrics. If you're working on a Christmas project, you can put Christmas grimeguard on it. If you're working on Halloween, say you're a Snoopy fan, go ahead and find yourself some really fun Snoopy fabric. Or as I said, you can get a fat quarter and piece it together and it won't have that much left over. And if you do have leftover fabric and it's for your mom for Mother's Day, go ahead and make her a little coin purse. I'll pop up the video up there in the iCard so you can go ahead and see how that works. That's it for me. I hope everyone has a great week and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.